Listen, I need to tell you about Elias and Lena Quinn because their story is going to mess with your head in all the ways that matter. This isn't some bullshit romance where love conquers all. This is about what happens when two people build a life on lies so beautiful they start believing them too. But before we dive into this mess, I need to know something. Have you ever loved someone you couldn't be completely honest with? Like, really think about it. Drop a comment and tell me what secret you're carrying. Because this story is going to hit different if you've ever been on either side of a beautiful lie. Elias Quinn was the kind of cop who still believed in good guys and bad guys when he was 37 years old. I know, right? In this world, at that age, still thinking in black and white. His colleagues called him Boy Scout behind his back, but not in a mean way. More like you'd talk about a golden retriever who keeps bringing you sticks, even though you've stopped throwing them. He worked cold cases mostly, the ones that kept other detectives up at night until they learned to stop caring. But Elias never learned to stop caring. He had this wall in his apartment covered with photos and red string like some conspiracy theorist, except instead of aliens, he was tracking art thieves and con artists who'd gone quiet years ago. The centerpiece of that wall was everything he had on someone called the Wraith. 12 years of thefts, each one more impossible than the last. Museums, private collections, auction houses. Never anything small, never anything easy. Never anything that wouldn't make headlines. And then, 5 years ago, nothing. The Wraith just vanished like smoke. His captain kept telling him to let it go. Dead-end cases don't get you promoted, Quinn. But Elias couldn't let it go because the Wraith was perfect, and perfect criminals don't just retire. They get caught, they die, or they make a mistake. Those are the only three endings his world allowed for. What Elias didn't know was that the Wraith hadn't made a mistake. She'd fallen in love. Lena had been working the coffee shop on 5th Street for 2 months when she first saw him. Not because she needed the job, obviously. She had enough money hidden away to disappear to 3 different countries and live comfortably for the rest of her life. But she was tired of disappearing. Tired of being nobody. Tired of looking over her shoulder every time she heard sirens. So she got a job making lattes for normal people with normal problems. She rented a studio apartment with thin walls where she could hear her neighbors fighting about whose turn it was to take out the trash. She bought groceries and watched Netflix and tried to figure out what regular people did with all the time she used to spend planning heists. It was boring as hell, and she'd never been happier. Then this guy started coming in every Tuesday and Thursday, ordering black coffee and sitting in the corner booth with case files spread out like he was solving the mysteries of the universe. He had this intensity about him that made her nervous in a way she hadn't felt since her first museum job, but it wasn't the bad kind of nervous. It was the kind that made her hands shake when she handed him his coffee, made her stomach do stupid things when he said thank you. She watched him for 3 weeks before she worked up the courage to look at what he was reading. And when she saw her own work spread across his table, photos of crime scenes she remembered like other people remember birthdays, she should have walked away, should have quit that job and caught the next bus to anywhere else. Instead, she sat down across from him and said, "You look like you could use some help." That's how it started. The most honest relationship of her life, built on the biggest lie she'd ever told. They talked for 2 hours that first day. He told her about his frustration with cold cases, about how the Wraith had been his white whale for over a decade. She told him she'd always been interested in true crime. Asked smart questions that made him think she was just naturally intuitive about criminal psychology. She wasn't lying about being interested. She was fascinated hearing how her work looked from the other side, how this man had constructed an entire mythology around her methods. In his mind, the Wraith was a ghost, untouchable and unknowable. In reality, she was sitting 3 feet away from him, wearing a coffee-stained apron and falling stupidly in love. The second time they met, he brought photos of the crime scenes. She helped him organize them chronologically, pointed out patterns he'd missed, suggested connections between cases that hadn't occurred to him before. She was careful not to be too insightful, but it was hard. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to explain why she'd chosen each target, what those bastards had done to deserve losing their precious art to someone who'd appreciate it more. But she also wanted to keep sitting across from him in that coffee shop, talking about everything except the truth. The third time, he asked her out. She said yes because she was an idiot. Because she thought she could have this one thing, this one person, without it costing anyone anything. Because she'd spent 15 years being the Wraith and she was ready to try being someone else for a while. Their first official date was dinner at a place downtown where the wine cost more than most people made in a day. Elias kept apologizing for the expense, but Lena had eaten in restaurants like this before, usually while casing them for security weaknesses, but still, she let him pay because it clearly mattered to him, and she was learning that normal people had pride about weird things. She also learned that normal people asked questions about your past, your family, your dreams for the future. Questions she had to make up answers for on the spot. She told him she'd grown up in foster care, which was true. Said she'd studied art history in college, which was partially true if you counted breaking into art history professors' offices to steal their research. Claimed she'd never been married, never been arrested, never done anything more illegal than jaywalking. 3 out of 3 lies, told so smoothly he never questioned any of it. In return, he told her about growing up the son of a cop who died in the line of duty when Elias was 12. About deciding that same day that he'd spend his life making sure bad guys didn't win. About his ex-wife who'd left him because she was tired of coming second to his cases. "I'm probably not good relationship material," he warned her over dessert. "I get obsessed with work. I bring it home. I have trust issues." Lena almost laughed, almost told him that trust issues were the least of their problems. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Another lie, but this one felt different. This one felt like a promise she wanted to keep. They moved in together after 4 months. She kept the coffee shop job for appearances, but started helping him with his cases more systematically. She had insights that amazed him, could look at crime scene photos and immediately identify weaknesses in security that had taken him months to spot. "You should have been a cop," he told her one night, papers spread across their kitchen table. "You've got better instincts than half my department." She kissed him instead of answering, because what was she supposed to say? That she'd been on the other side of those instincts for most of her adult life? That everything he admired about her mind was trained by years of breaking laws he'd sworn to uphold? The Wraith case sat in a box under their bed. He'd brought it home from the office when they got serious, told her he couldn't let it go completely, but couldn't stand looking at it every day either. Sometimes she'd hear him down there in the middle of the night, going through the files like a prayer he'd forgotten the words to. She never looked in that box. She was afraid of what she might find, afraid he'd gotten closer to the truth than she realized, afraid he hadn't gotten close at all. They got married on a Tuesday in the courthouse downtown. No big wedding because Lena claimed she didn't have family to invite, and Elias said he didn't need anyone but her. The judge who married them had prosecuted 3 cases involving stolen art that year. Lena had committed 2 of them. She signed the marriage certificate with her real name, which she hadn't used in so long it felt like writing in a foreign language. Helena Vasquez became Lena Quinn, and just like that, the Wraith officially died. Or so she thought. Their daughter was born 18 months later. Iris Quinn, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's talent for seeing things other people missed. Lena held her for the first time and understood immediately that everything had changed. Not just her priorities or her future plans, but the actual structure of reality. She couldn't be the Wraith anymore because she was someone's mother. And she couldn't tell Elias the truth because he was someone's father. The secret that had started as self-preservation became something bigger, something that felt necessary for all 3 of them. Elias was a good father, patient and careful and absolutely devoted to this tiny person who'd arrived in their lives like a miracle he hadn't known he was waiting for. He read to Iris every night, voices for all the characters, making up elaborate stories when the books ran out. Lena watched them together and felt something she'd never experienced before, not just love, but belonging. Like she'd finally found the thing worth stealing that couldn't be taken away. For 8 years it worked. Elias got promoted to detective, started working newer cases that didn't keep him up at night. Lena went back to school, got a degree in art history that she could actually put on a resume. Iris grew up smart and curious and completely unaware that her mother used to be one of the most wanted criminals in the world. They were happy. Genuinely, surprisingly, dangerously happy. And then Silas came back. Lena saw him first at Iris's school play, just standing in the back of the auditorium like he belonged there, like 8 years in federal prison hadn't changed him at all. Their eyes met across a room full of parents with smartphones, and she felt the bottom drop out of her carefully constructed life. Silas had been her partner for 3 years before she met Elias. More than that, really. He was the closest thing to family she'd had since aging out of foster care. They'd learned the trade together, perfected techniques together, shared the kind of trust that only develops when your life depends on someone else's silence. When she decided to retire, she tried to convince him to come with her. But Silas was addicted to the work in a way she'd never been. For her, stealing was about survival, then freedom, then art. For him, it was about the rush, the proof that he could take whatever he wanted and no one could stop him. "One more job," he'd said when she told him she was done. "Give me one more job and then we'll both disappear." But she was already halfway in love with a cop who thought he was hunting her, and one more job felt like one too many. So she'd left, just packed up her life and vanished without saying goodbye, because goodbyes were dangerous and she'd never learned how to have them anyway. Silas got caught on his next job. Museum security he'd never encountered before, cameras where they shouldn't have been, federal agents who seemed to know exactly where he'd be and when. He went down hard and took the fall alone, never gave up her name even when they offered him deals for information about the Wraith. 8 years, he did 8 years because she'd taught him loyalty and then abandoned him. Now he was out and he was standing in her daughter's school and she knew exactly why he was there. She didn't tell Elias. How could she? How do you explain to your husband that the reason you're suddenly jumpy and distracted is because your former partner in crime is back in town and probably wants to destroy everything you've built together? Instead, she tried to handle it quietly. Left work early one day and waited for Silas at the coffee shop where she'd first met Elias. Poetic justice, she supposed. Full circle. He showed up 20 minutes late, looking older but not broken. Prison had hardened him in ways she'd expected and softened him in ways she hadn't. He ordered black coffee and sat across from her like they were old friends catching up instead of criminals negotiating the terms of her surrender. "Nice life you've built," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Husband's a cop, kids in private school, house in the suburbs. Very domestic." "What do you want, Silas?" "What I've always wanted. What we used to want together." He pulled out his phone, showed her photos of museum floor plans, security schedules, acquisition reports. "The Kessler collection is going up for auction next month. Private showing, limited invitations, minimal security. It's perfect." She looked at the photos and felt her hands itch in a way they hadn't for years. The hands that had once worn soft leather gloves, that had touched priceless art in the moments before it disappeared. The Kessler collection was legendary among people in their former profession. Art stolen by Nazis, recovered after the war, tied up in legal disputes for decades. Half the pieces shouldn't be in private hands anyway. "I'm out," she said. "I've been out for 8 years. No one gets out, Lena. You know that. We just go dormant for a while. I'm not dormant. I'm done." "Are you?" "Because I've been watching you for 2 weeks and you case every building you walk into. Old habits." He was right and they both knew it. She still noticed security cameras, still automatically identified escape routes, still felt the familiar thrill when she saw something beautiful that was poorly protected. But noticing wasn't the same as acting, and she'd learned the difference. "I have a family now. You had a family before. Me. We were supposed to take care of each other. I left you money. Enough to disappear when you got out. I don't want money. I want my partner back." She met his eyes across the table and saw something that made her stomach clench. This wasn't just about the work. This was personal. This was about the 8 years he'd spent in a cell while she played house with a cop. "If you do this job," she said carefully, "if you go back to work, they'll catch you. They're better now, smarter, more connected. Not if I have help from someone who's been studying their methods for 8 years. Someone who's been married to one of them." And there it was, the real reason he was back. Not for one more job, but for revenge on the life she'd chosen over him. She left the coffee shop without agreeing to anything, but they both knew she was trapped. Silas wouldn't just expose her if she refused. He'd destroy her slowly, systematically, turning her life into evidence of everything she'd tried to leave behind. The first theft happened 3 days later. Nothing major, just a small gallery downtown that specialized in contemporary pieces. The kind of job that would barely make the local news except for one detail. The thief had left a calling card, a silver feather, the Wraith's old signature. Elias came home that night with an energy she hadn't seen in years. He spread crime scene photos across their kitchen table while Iris did homework in the next room. And Lena felt like she was watching her two lives collide in slow motion. "It's not possible," he kept saying. "The Wraith's been quiet for 8 years. Why come back now? Why this target? Why leave the signature when staying hidden would be smarter?" She made appropriate noises of interest while her mind raced through possibilities. Either Silas was trying to draw her out, or he was building up to something bigger. Either way, she was fucked. The second theft happened a week later. Bigger this time, a private collector who'd made his money in weapons manufacturing and spent it on art stolen from Jewish families during the war. Silas had taken 3 pieces worth more than most people's houses, and he'd left another feather. This time, Elias brought federal agents to the house. They sat in her living room drinking coffee she'd made them, asking if she'd noticed anything suspicious in the neighborhood, if Elias had mentioned any theories about the case. One of them was young, maybe 25, with the kind of intensity that reminded her of Elias when they first met. He kept looking around their house like he was memorizing details, and Lena realized he was. Not because he suspected anything, but because this was probably his first major case, and he was trying to learn from a detective with Elias's reputation. "The signature's interesting," the young agent said. "It's like whoever's doing this wants to be caught. Or wants credit for work they didn't do originally." "What do you mean?" Lena asked, even though she knew exactly what he meant. "The Wraith never left signatures before. Too careful, too professional. This feels different. Personal." After they left, Elias pulled out the box from under their bed. The box she'd never looked in, full of 8 years' worth of theories about who she used to be. "I need to go through all of this again," he said. "Compare the old methods to what's happening now. See if there's a connection I missed." She watched him spread out photos of her former life across their bedroom floor and felt something break inside her chest. Every crime scene was a memory. Every stolen piece was a story he'd never understand, because he'd never known the person who'd lived them. "Can I help?" she asked, because she was a masochist and because she needed to know how close he'd gotten to the truth. "Would you mind? Fresh eyes might catch something I've been missing." So she sat on their bedroom floor and helped her husband analyze her own crimes, pointing out patterns he'd never noticed while being careful not to reveal too much. It was the most intimate and dishonest conversation of their marriage, and that's saying something considering their marriage was built on the biggest lie she'd ever told. "She's good," Elias said, holding up a photo from the Delacroix Museum job. "Look at this entry point. Had to know the guard schedule, the camera rotations, the exhibit layout. This isn't random." Maybe she worked there. Maybe. Or maybe she's just that thorough. He had no idea he was talking about her in third person, describing her methods like she was a stranger he'd been hunting instead of the woman he'd been sleeping next to for 8 years. That's when Iris walked in. "What are you guys doing?" "Just work stuff, baby," Elias said, starting to gather up the photos. "Nothing interesting." But Iris was 10 years old, and 10-year-olds have a talent for seeing exactly what you don't want them to see. "Is that the lady who steals paintings?" she asked, pointing to a sketch artist's rendering that looked nothing like Lena but somehow captured something essential about the Wraith's energy. "The one who only takes stuff from bad people?" Lena's blood froze. "Where did you hear that?" "You told me. In the stories about the gentleman thief who only stole from mean kings and gave the treasure to kids who needed it." And just like that, Lena realized how badly she'd fucked up. The bedtime stories she'd been telling Iris weren't just entertainment. They were confessions, sanitized and romanticized, but true in all the ways that mattered. She'd been teaching her daughter to admire the Wraith without realizing she was teaching her to admire her mother's criminal past. "Okay, pause. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest in the comments. When you were a kid, Did you ever catch your parents in a lie that changed everything? Because this moment right here, this is every kid's worst nightmare and biggest relief all at once. Tell me about the moment you realized your parents were just flawed humans pretending to have their shit together. Those were just stories, sweetie, Elias said. The real art thief isn't like that. How do you know? Because real criminals don't steal from bad people and give to good people. They steal for money or for the thrill, or because they don't care about the law. Iris looked at the photos spread across the floor, her dark eyes moving from crime scene to crime scene with the kind of focus that reminded Lena of herself at that age. But what if they do? Iris asked. What if the art thief really is like the gentleman thief? What if she only takes things from people who don't deserve them? Elias laughed, but not in a mean way. Then she'd still be a criminal, baby. Good intentions don't make breaking the law okay. Even if the law is wrong. And that was the question that kept Lena awake for the next 3 nights. Even if the law is wrong, even if the system is rigged, even if the people she'd stolen from had gotten their wealth by stealing from others, legal or not. She'd never taught Iris that moral complexity was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. Had never explained that sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between wrong and worse. Instead, she'd told her fairy tales about noble thieves and corrupt kings, and now her daughter was asking the kind of questions that could destroy their family. The third theft happened on a Tuesday. Bigger again, more daring, and this time Silas had left something extra with the silver feather. A note written in code that only one person would be able to read. Elias brought it home in an evidence bag, frustrated because the federal team's codebreakers hadn't been able to crack it. It's not a standard cipher, he told Lena over dinner. Could be personal, something only the Wraith would understand. Maybe a message for a partner we don't know about. Lena looked at the note and felt her mouth go dry. It was a message for her, all right. Written in the same code she and Silas had used for 3 years to communicate during jobs. See you soon, partner. That night, after Elias was asleep, she snuck downstairs and called Silas from a burner phone she'd kept hidden in the garage for 8 years, never quite able to throw away all of her old tools. I got your note. I was wondering when you'd call. Took you longer than expected. This needs to stop. This needs to get started. I've been patient, Lena. I've been careful, but patience has limits. What do you want? I want you to remember who you used to be. I want you to stop playing house with a cop who'd throw you in prison if he knew the truth. I want you to come home. This is my home. No, this is your cover story, and it's time to blow it. The line went dead. She sat in her garage for an hour, surrounded by suburban normal things like lawnmowers and Christmas decorations, and tried to figure out how to save her family from the truth about who she used to be. The next morning, Iris came downstairs for breakfast with a notebook full of drawings. Crime scenes, but not the ones from Elias's case files. These were scenes from her bedtime stories, detailed sketches of the gentleman thief's adventures, rendered with the kind of precision that made Lena's hands shake. What's this, baby? I'm writing a book about the gentleman thief. For school, we're supposed to write about heroes. Elias looked over from his coffee. Heroes? The gentleman thief is a hero. She only steals from bad people, and she never hurts anyone, and she always escapes because she's smarter than everyone else. Lena felt like she was watching her daughter describe her own mother without knowing it, and the cognitive dissonance was making her physically sick. Criminals aren't heroes, Iris, Elias said gently, even if they think they have good reasons for what they do. But what if the good reasons are really good? What if the bad people she steals from are really, really bad? It doesn't matter. The law exists for a reason. But what if the law is stupid? And there was that question again, the one Lena had been asking herself since she was Iris's age, growing up in foster homes where following the rules meant getting hurt and breaking them meant survival. That afternoon, Silas called her at work. Cute kid, he said. Smart too. Wonder where she gets that from. Lena's blood turned to ice. If you go anywhere near my daughter, relax. I'm not interested in kids, but I am interested in what she might know about her mother's past. Kids notice things. And this kid's been raised on stories about art thieves. She doesn't know anything. Maybe not yet. But she's asking questions, and eventually she's going to ask the right one. He was right. Iris was too smart, too curious, and too surrounded by evidence of her mother's former life to stay ignorant forever. Sooner or later, she'd put together the pieces that Elias had missed for 8 years. "One job," Lena said. "Give me the details for one job, and then you disappear forever." "I'm not interested in one job. I'm interested in getting my life back. Your life was going to end in prison anyway. I gave you 8 extra years of freedom. You gave me 8 years of wondering why I wasn't worth saving." And there it was. The real wound underneath all the anger and threats. Silas hadn't just lost a partner when she left. He'd lost the only person who'd ever chosen him over everything else. "I couldn't save both of us," she said quietly. "And I was tired of running." "So you chose him. I chose stability. I chose normal. I chose a future that didn't involve looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. You chose a lie. Maybe. But it's a lie that made me happy. For how long? How long before the guilt eats you alive? How long before your daughter figures out that her hero bedtime stories are actually confessions? How long before your husband realizes he's been sleeping with the enemy for 8 years? The line went dead again, but his questions followed her home and sat with her through dinner and kept her awake until 3 in the morning. How long? How long before the weight of 8 years' worth of lies became too much to carry? How long before Iris asked a question she couldn't answer without revealing everything? How long before Elias looked at her and saw the Wraith instead of his wife? She was running out of time, and she knew it. The only question was whether the truth would come out because she chose to tell it, or because she waited too long to choose anything at all. The fourth theft was different. Bigger, bolder, and targeted at something that made Elias go completely still when he saw the crime scene photos. "He took the Monet," he said, staring at pictures of an empty frame hanging on a mansion wall. "The bastard took the Monet." "What Monet?" "The one that disappeared from the Gardner Museum in 1990. Supposedly stolen by the Irish mob, but it never surfaced. Turns out some collector bought it under the table and has been keeping it in his private residence for 30 years. How is that legal?" "It's not. FBI's been trying to prove he had it for decades, but they could never get a warrant to search his property. Now the Wraith just handed them all the evidence they need that it was there." Lena felt something twist in her stomach. This wasn't just theft. This was Silas forcing law enforcement to expose corruption they'd been unable to touch through legal channels. This was him using her old methods for something that looked suspiciously like justice. So the thief actually did a good thing. The thief committed a federal crime. It doesn't matter if the victim was also a criminal. But he didn't sound convinced. For the first time since the theft started, Elias looked like he was questioning something fundamental about the case. That night, Iris asked the question Lena had been dreading. "Mom, how do you know so much about art?" They were at the kitchen table, Iris working on her gentleman thief story while Lena helped with math homework. Normal domestic stuff that felt anything but normal. "I studied it in college. But you know, weird stuff, like about security systems and how paintings are stored and which museums have the best pieces. I read a lot." "Dad doesn't know that stuff, and he's been studying art thieves for years." Lena put down her pencil and looked at her daughter. Really looked at her, 10 years old, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a mind that was already making connections no one wanted her to make. "What are you asking me, baby?" "I'm asking if you used to be the gentleman thief." The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Lena could lie, should lie. Had been lying successfully for 8 years and could probably keep lying for 8 more. Instead, she said, "Why would you think that?" "Because you tell the stories like you were there. Because you know things Dad doesn't know, even though he's the detective. Because every time he talks about the Wraith, you get this look on your face like you're remembering something you're not supposed to remember." "And what if I was? Then I'd think you were even cooler than I already do." It was the worst possible answer. The answer that made Lena realize she'd raised her daughter to admire exactly the kind of person Elias had dedicated his life to catching. "Crime isn't cool, Iris. It's dangerous and wrong, and it hurts people. But the gentleman thief only stole from people who deserved it. How do you decide who deserves it? How do you decide your opinion matters more than the law? The same way you decided Dad deserved to not know the truth about who you really are. And there it was, 10 years old, and Iris had just articulated the central hypocrisy of Lena's entire life. She'd been making decisions about what other people deserved to know, what they deserved to keep, what they deserved to lose. She'd been playing judge and jury for 8 years, first with art collectors and then with her own family. It's complicated, was all she could say. Adults always say that when they don't want to admit they're being hypocrites. That night, Lena called Silas back. I'll do it. One job, and then you disappear forever. What changed your mind? My daughter's too smart for her own good. And I'm tired of lying to people I love. Good. Because I've got the perfect target, someone who definitely deserves what's coming to him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A private collector who'd built his fortune on insurance fraud and money laundering, whose art collection was essentially a money-washing operation, disguised as cultural appreciation. 3 pieces worth more than most people's houses, housed in a penthouse with security that looked impressive, but had weaknesses only someone with Lena's experience would spot. In and out in 20 minutes. No one gets hurt. The stolen pieces would be returned anonymously to the museums they'd been stolen from originally. Clean ending to a dirty story, except nothing about her life had been clean for 8 years, and there was no reason to expect it to start now. The job was set for Friday night. Elias would be working late on the task force trying to catch the Wraith. Iris would be at a sleepover at her friend's house. Lena would finally put on her old gear and become someone she hadn't been in almost a decade. She should have been nervous, should have been terrified. Instead, she felt relief so intense it was almost physical. Finally, she was going to stop lying about who she used to be. Thursday night, Elias came home with news that made her stomach drop. We got a break in the case. Anonymous tip about where the Wraith might strike next. Really? Friday night, private collector uptown, FBI's setting up surveillance now. Lena felt the ground disappear from under her feet. Silas had set her up, had fed information to the task force to ensure she'd be caught. This wasn't about one last job. This was about making sure her 2 lives collided as publicly and destructively as possible. That's great news, she managed to say. It is. We're finally going to catch this bastard. She went upstairs and called Silas from her burner phone. You son of a bitch. I'm sorry. You tipped them off. You told them about the job. I have no idea what you're talking about. This was never about working together again. This was about forcing me to choose between getting caught and letting you destroy my family. This was about reminding you that you can't escape who you really are. You're not Lena Quinn, suburban mom with a clean conscience. You're Helena Vasquez, and you're a thief, and you've been lying to everyone you claim to love for 8 years. And what exactly do you get out of destroying my life? I get to stop being the only one paying for decisions we both made. She hung up and sat on her bathroom floor for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to save her family from the truth about who she used to be. The only way out was through. She could disappear that night, vanish like she should have 8 years ago, leave Elias and Iris to wonder what happened to her, but never know the truth. Or she could stay and face whatever came next. She chose to stay. Friday evening, she helped Iris pack for her sleepover and watched Elias get ready for what he thought would be the biggest arrest of his career. Normal family stuff, except she knew it was probably the last normal evening they'd ever have. Be careful tonight, she told him at the door. Always am. I mean it. Some people are more dangerous when they're cornered. He kissed her goodbye, and she watched him drive away to catch her, and she thought about how much easier it would have been if she'd never fallen in love with him in the first place. At 9 o'clock, she put on black clothes and tied her hair back and became the Wraith for what she hoped would be the last time. Her hands found the old gloves in the bottom of her closet, soft leather that still fit perfectly after all these years. The penthouse was exactly as Silas had described it. 37th floor, private elevator, security system that relied more on height than sophistication. She was inside in 12 minutes, had located all 3 target pieces in another 5. That's when she heard the sirens. Not just police sirens, but the federal task force's unmarked cars and the FBI's tactical units. More law enforcement than had ever been deployed for one of her jobs, because they thought they were finally ending an 8-year hunt. She had maybe 3 minutes before they reached her floor. Instead of running, she sat down in the middle of the collector's living room, surrounded by stolen art and evidence of her own crimes, and waited. She pulled off the gloves one last time, placed them carefully on the coffee table next to a silver feather she'd never intended to leave. When the door burst open and tactical officers flooded the apartment, she was exactly where they expected her to be. When they shouted for her to get on the ground, she complied immediately. When they cuffed her and read her rights, she didn't say a word. But when Elias walked through that door and saw her face, the sound he made was something she'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. "No," he said. "No, no, no. This isn't happening." She looked up at him from the floor, her hands cuffed behind her back, and said the only thing she could say. "I'm sorry." The ride to the federal building happened in complete silence. Elias sat in the passenger seat of the lead car, staring straight ahead like if he didn't look at her, this wouldn't be real. Lena sat in the back seat behind bulletproof glass, watching the city pass by and thinking about how to explain 8 years of lies to a 10-year-old who thought her mother was a hero. The questioning lasted 6 hours. They had her on everything: fingerprints from crime scenes going back 12 years, security camera footage that finally made sense, testimony from fences and forgers who'd been waiting for deals to give up the Wraith's real name. She answered every question honestly: dates, methods, accomplices, buyers. 8 years of buried truth spilling out in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and industrial carpet. The only thing she wouldn't give them was Silas. "He's not part of this week's thefts," she told them. "Those were all me. We have evidence that suggests otherwise." "Your evidence is wrong." It wasn't loyalty that made her protect him. It was the understanding that some forms of revenge are their own punishment. Silas would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd destroyed the only person who'd ever chosen him, and that was worse than any prison sentence. They offered her deals: information about other criminals in exchange for reduced sentences, details about unsolved cases in exchange for minimum security, cooperation in exchange for considerations about her daughter's future. She turned down everything except the chance to see Elias before they transferred her to holding. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in one night, still wearing the same clothes he'd put on that morning when he thought he was married to an art history major instead of the most wanted art thief in federal history. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Known what?" "That I was hunting you. How long have you been sitting across the breakfast table from me, listening to me talk about catching the Wraith, knowing it was you?" "Since the day we met." 8 years. You've been lying to me for 8 years. Not about everything, not about loving you. How can you say that? How can you claim you love someone you've been lying to since the day you met them?" "Because I fell in love with you the first time you showed me those crime scene photos. Because every time you talked about the Wraith, you weren't talking about a criminal. You were talking about someone you respected, even if you didn't want to admit it. Because you spent 8 years trying to understand me without knowing you were sleeping next to me every night. I was trying to catch you. You were trying to understand me. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands like they might have answers written on them. "What about Iris? What about her? She thinks you're a hero. She thinks the Wraith is some kind of noble thief who only steals from bad people. How do I explain to our daughter that her mother is a criminal?" Maybe you start by explaining that the world isn't made of good people and bad people. Maybe you tell her that sometimes good people do bad things for complicated reasons. Maybe you help her understand that loving someone doesn't mean you have to approve of everything they've ever done. She's 10 years old. She's old enough to understand that adults make mistakes. And she's smart enough to know that something's been wrong in our house for a while now. Wrong how? "Elias, we've been living a lie for 8 years. Did you really think she hadn't noticed?" The next 18 months were the hardest of all their lives. Lena pled guilty to everything they could prove and some things they couldn't, because prolonging the legal process would only make things worse for Iris. She got 12 years with possibility of parole in 8, which was better than life and worse than she'd hoped. Elias took early retirement from the police force, not because of scandal, but because he couldn't trust his own judgment anymore. If he'd missed this for 8 years, what else had he missed? How could he be responsible for other people's safety when he couldn't even tell when his own wife was lying to him? Iris went to therapy twice a week and asked hard questions that none of the adults in her life knew how to answer. Why hadn't her mother trusted her with the truth? Why hadn't her father noticed something was wrong? Why had both of them been lying to her about who they really were? The answers were complicated because life is complicated, and 10-year-olds deserve better than complicated answers to simple questions about whether their parents love them. Lena served 3 years before making parole. She got out on good behavior and a recommendation from the non-profit that helped her develop job skills while she was inside. Turns out, someone with her particular talents was very good at consulting on museum security systems, and there were legal ways to make a living understanding how criminals think. Elias never remarried. He worked as a private investigator, specializing in finding missing persons, and discovered that he was better at helping people when the stakes were high were personal instead of political. He dated occasionally, but never seriously, partly because he didn't trust his own judgment about people anymore, and partly because he was still in love with his ex-wife. Iris grew up understanding that love is complicated, that adults make mistakes, and that sometimes the people who hurt you are the same people who would do anything to protect you. She studied psychology in college and wrote her senior thesis on the children of incarcerated parents, interviewing dozens of kids who'd grown up with the same questions she'd been asking since she was 10. She still saw both her parents regularly, not together because that was too complicated for everyone involved, but separately. Dinners with her father where they talked about his cases and her classes and anything except the past. Visits with her mother where they worked through the complicated process of rebuilding trust that had been broken before Iris was old enough to know it existed. When Iris turned 21, she asked the question that had been bothering her for over a decade. Do you regret it? Any of it? They were sitting in a coffee shop downtown, not far from where her parents had first met. The same place where everything had started with lies and might finally end with truth. Lena was working as a security consultant now, helping museums protect their collections from people like she used to be. Respectable work that paid well and let her use her skills for something constructive. Which part? The stealing. The lying, leaving Silas in prison, marrying Dad without telling him who you really were. Take your pick. I regret hurting people I love. I regret that you grew up thinking love meant keeping secrets. I regret that your father spent 8 years not knowing who he was married to. But not the rest of it. The stealing. Number. I'm not sorry I took things from people who'd stolen them from someone else first. I'm not sorry I redistributed wealth from people who'd gotten it through exploitation. I'm not sorry I was good at something that required intelligence and courage and creativity. What about the lying? I'm sorry the lying hurt you and your father. I'm not sorry it gave me 8 years of the happiest life I'd ever had. Even though it wasn't real. It was real. Everything I felt for you and your father was real. The life we built together was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the story I told about my past. But don't you think Dad deserved to know the truth? I think your father deserved a lot of things he didn't get. A wife who hadn't spent her 20s committing federal crimes. A family that didn't come with the constant threat of exposure. A marriage that wasn't built on deception. That's not what I asked. Lena was quiet for a long time, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't want to drink. I think your father deserved the right to make an informed choice about whether he wanted to love me. I took that choice away from him by not telling him who I really was. That was selfish and wrong, and I knew it was selfish and wrong when I did it. So why did you do it? Because I was tired of being alone. Because I'd never had a normal life and I wanted to try it once. Because I fell in love with someone I couldn't have if I was honest about who I was. And you don't regret that? I regret how it ended. I don't regret that it happened. It wasn't the answer Iris had been expecting, but it was the first completely honest thing her mother had ever said to her about the choices that had shaped all their lives. They sat in silence for a while, watching people walk past the window with normal problems and normal relationships and normal families that hadn't been built on beautiful lies. I used to be angry, Iris said finally, at both of you. For lying, for hurting each other, for making everything so complicated. You had a right to be angry. I know, but I'm not anymore. What changed? I realized that you're both just people. Flawed, complicated people who made mistakes and tried to fix them and made more mistakes in the process. Just like everyone else. Is that enough? Being just people? It has to be, because the alternative is spending my whole life angry at you for not being perfect, and that doesn't help anyone. They finished their coffee and walked to their cars, and Lena thought about how proud she was of the person her daughter had become, despite everything she'd done wrong as a mother. That evening, Iris called her father. I had coffee with Mom today. How is she? Good. Different, but good. She likes her job. I'm glad. She's still in love with you, you know. Elias was quiet for so long that Iris wondered if the call had dropped. That's complicated, he said finally. Everything about our family is complicated. Doesn't mean it's not worth dealing with. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time to stop punishing each other for mistakes you made over a decade ago. I'm saying maybe you should call her. I don't know if I can trust her. You don't have to trust her. You just have to decide if you want to try. That night, Elias sat in his apartment looking at his phone and thinking about forgiveness and second chances and whether love was enough to rebuild something that had been broken for so long. He didn't call her that night, or the next night, or the night after that. But eventually he did, because Iris was right about one thing. Their family was complicated, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth trying to figure out. The conversation was awkward and painful and necessary. They met for dinner at a restaurant neither of them had been to before, neutral territory where they could try to be honest with each other without the weight of all their shared history. I'm not the same person I was when you met me, Lena said over appetizers neither of them was eating. Neither am I. Are you better or worse? Different. More careful, less trusting, more aware of how much I don't know about the people I love. I'm sorry I took that innocence away from you. I'm not sure innocence is the right word. Naivety maybe, and maybe losing it was overdue. They talked for 3 hours, about their marriage, their mistakes, their daughter, their regrets, about whether love could survive deception, whether trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, whether two people could start over when they'd never really known each other in the first place. They didn't solve anything that night, didn't get back together, didn't make promises they weren't sure they could keep. But they agreed to keep talking, keep trying, keep figuring out what their relationship could become now that it was finally built on truth instead of lies. It took 2 more years before they moved back in together. Not because they'd solved all their problems, but because they'd learned how to live with the problems they couldn't solve. Not because they trusted each other completely, but because they'd figured out how to love each other imperfectly. Iris was a senior in college when her parents remarried. Small ceremony, just the 3 of them, and a judge who specialized in complicated families. No big wedding because they'd learned that grand gestures don't fix fundamental problems, and small honest moments matter more than perfect ones anyway. Do you take Elias to be your husband? The judge asked. I do, Lena said, for real this time. Do you take Helena to be your wife? I do, Elias said, knowing exactly who I'm marrying. They kissed like people who'd earned each other through years of hard work instead of people who'd stumbled into love by accident. It was better than romance. It was real. Lena's new wedding band gleamed faintly on her finger, the same silver as the feather she'd left behind years ago. Different symbol, same metal. Some things change, some things endure. That night they sat on their couch in the house they'd bought together, the house where they'd learned how to be honest with each other, and Iris asked them the question she'd been saving for over a decade. Are you happy? We're trying to be, Elias said. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. But it's more honest. And honest is what we do now, Lena added, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Iris looked at her parents, these 2 people who'd spent so much of her childhood lying to each other and to her, who'd finally learned how to love each other without pretending to be perfect. and realized something that had taken her 23 years to understand. The next morning's newspaper would carry a small item buried on page 6. Anonymous donation return stolen Monet to Gardner Museum. No one would connect it to the security consultant who'd recently advised them on their new alarm system. Some gifts don't need signatures. Lena still walked that edge between justice and crime, but now she did it with full disclosure. Elias knew about every returned painting, every anonymous tip, every time his wife bent the law to serve something bigger than herself. He didn't always approve, but he always understood. Because that's what love actually looks like when you strip away the fairy tale bullshit. Imperfect people doing the hard work of being honest, even when honesty hurts. Especially when honesty hurts. Love still isn't pretty, but it's real, and that's enough. Before I finish this, I want to hear from you one more time. What's the hardest truth you've ever had to tell someone you love? Or the hardest truth someone's ever told you? Share it in the comments if you're brave enough. Because the thing about truth is, it's only scary until you say it out loud. Then it just becomes part of your story. Sometimes the best lies are the ones that help you find the truth.